So thanks all for coming by today for a session on, or a new topic that I'm trying to describe today on correlation clustering, which is going to be mostly a computer science talk, although there has been a lot of work in a related topic, community detection, that all of you have heard. It's a buzzword these days in the information theory community as well. So what are network communities, which is really the main topic of this presentation? You have heard a lot of, about networks and network communities. One of the most famous examples people tend to give you is this karate club community structure. And nowadays, we associate communities with special structures in graphs. The graphs can be directed or undirected. They may be hypergraphs as well, and these special structures that we are looking at and we call communities are dense-induced subgraphs. In this karate club, you can see vertices colored in blue and vertices colored in red, and the notion of a community is associated with edge densities within these induced subgraphs, so you can say that the density of edges within this group of vertices is larger than the edge density between vertices in this set and in this set. And based on that, you would say that the red vertices form one community and the blue vertices form another community. In gene regulatory networks, another type of networks that have received a lot of attention, you can define communities in a very similar way. There are so-called pathways that define communities, and they're again most often described in terms of dense-induced subgraphs, and the graphs are usually directed because if a gene influences another gene, it doesn't mean that the interactions go the opposite direction as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is two non-standard ways, or basically different ways to talk about community structure in networks, and in particular biological and social networks. And the first topic that I'll explain to you is something that people in machine learning would call latent feature models for communities, or communities that have the property that they're overlapping and hierarchically organized. And in this case, what I will talk about is a new area in mathematics, and which is based on a topic that has received very little attention in graph theory, which is a pity. It's called intersection representations of graphs. And the whole theory of intersection graphs, chordal graphs, and other special graph classes that have been studied. And a new class of graphs that we call Boolean intersection graphs that I hope to explain in more detail in a second. And the other notion that I will discuss is definitions of communities based on motifs. And this is, again, a sort of brand new topic area, where we are really interested in communities that have a large density of motifs, which are, again, some small induced subgraphs. For example, think of social networks as having a lot of triangles. These are well-known motifs in social networks. And if you want to define a community, why look at the edge density? Why not look at the motif density in order to better describe this structure? And in this case, I will talk about how to revise notions such as the Cheeger constant, or correlation or community detection methods that operate around motif structures. So why is this important? I already mentioned. For example, in social networks, nodes form a large number, or consist of a large number of triangles. Just look at this karate club example. Look at how many triangles they are. And I may as well have defined this community, red community or blue community, in terms of density of triangles rather than in terms of edge density. Or in or in gene regulatory networks, most of these star communities that you see here are formed based on shared functionalities and shared sequence features and other features. And it makes sense to look at communities in terms of shared features rather than just edge density. So let me go and discuss this notion of overlapping community detection and the underlying theory of intersection graphs. So let's assume the following really straightforward question. You are given a graph, and you're given just the network topology, basically. And edges indicate some form of interaction or friendship. And the question is, can I look at this graph and decide what kind of shared properties do these vertices have that led to such an interaction or friendship graph? So for example, let's say that this graph was obtained not from a karate club, but from people's interests in games. So what you can say is, for example, who plays chess? And then it may turn out that these three people that represent vertices in this graph have a common interest or a common feature that they're all playing chess. So the next question is, this explains why these three people are friends, but it doesn't explain why this person and this person are not friends, why this guy here and this guy is not a friend. So maybe there is another game that people are interested in. Maybe there are some people that are interested in blackjack. And for example, this person here and this person here and this person here may be interested in blackjack. And that would explain why this person is not interested or friends with this person here, because they don't share any common interests in game. One is interested in chess, the other one is interested in blackjack. And then a third question could be, what kind of third game would lead to a friendship graph like this one here? So maybe a third game, Go, is the game of interest for these three people, and no other element or player in this graph is interested in Go. So basically, Go is only a game of interest for these three people. So this is a way to look at the graph topology and try to assign features or interests, and this is just a very straightforward example, that explain the network topology. In what sense? If people share at least one feature, they will be connected with an edge. If they don't share any common features, they will not be connected by an edge. So for example, this guy is only interested in chess. Oops, this guy shouldn't have had chess. Sorry, this is a mistake. This guy should just play blackjack and Go. So there would be only edges between players that share some game interest, and no edges between players that don't share any interest in the same game. So how does a community structure arise now? It's pretty straightforward to think of every game as giving rise to one community. So for example, all those guys that play blackjack and those guys that play chess belong to this community. Blackjack, they belong to this community. And sorry, this one here was supposed to be the Go community. So what is interesting is the communities are intersecting, because people can play 2 different games or even 3 different games. So each feature gives rise to one community, and the communities can intersect. And in this case, we have 3 communities, 1 for each game, blackjack, chess, and Go. And we can basically explain the graph structure by using such assignments, not just for games, but for anything we know the network players are interested, network entities are interested in. So this kind of model for the creation of communities or community structure was only proposed recently in 2014 by people at Yahoo, Bonki et al. And it was only one person took up the analysis, Tsurakakis, who is currently at Harvard University working with Michael Mitzenmacher. And they said, this is a very interesting question from many different points of view. It allows you to define communities, and it opens up a bunch of interesting combinatorial questions. So here is now a proper definition of the question that we are after. And the proper definition says that when we have a graph topology, we are given connections between vertices in a graph, edges basically. We want to find an intersection representation, which is basically an assignment of subset of features to every vertex in the graph, where we take features from a sufficiently large ground set. So we have a very large set of features we can choose from. We take subset of these features, we assign them to vertices, and we say the 2 vertices form an edge if and only if their set of features intersects, and the intersection is clearly non-empty. Yes, please.
Is it the same as saying that the graph is the union of cliques?
I'll come to that in 2 sentences. Yep. You have an edge clique cover, and the number of cliques that you use for the cover is exactly what you're asking. So the intersection number of a graph, or of an undirected graph, is really the smallest possible cardinality of the ground set S, the set of features. So if you saw the graph that I just described with the game players, I could have taken a much larger set of features and then make an assignment over a much larger set of games. But to explain the graph, I really did need only 3 games. I could have used more, but it would be redundant. So the question of interest is, what is the intersection number of a graph, which is basically the smallest cardinality of the ground set for which we can find a consistent representation of the graph in terms of intersections of intervals. And in 1966, so this was an ancient topic that people really haven't looked into, Erdős proved that the intersection number, which goes back to the question just raised, is equivalent to the edge clique cover of G. So it asks what is the smallest number of cliques that you have to use in order to cover all edges in the graph. And the edge clique cover immediately associates you again with community structures, the communities being cliques, and you're asking how many potentially overlapping cliques do you need to cover the graph. So other extensions were reported in the graph theory literature, and I want to tell you maybe 15 or 20 papers on the topic were published in the graph theory literature so far, is to say that you don't have, it would be too unrestrictive to say that people are friends if and only if they share one feature, at least one feature. You can go ahead and say, what if I require two people to be connected if and only if they share at least p features? And in the graph theory community, this is known as the p intersection number. So let me go and just quickly show this example here. You remember, forget about this mistake. This is not supposed to be chess here. The intersection number is 3 because I needed 3 features to consistently explain this graph. And it's easy to show that I couldn't have explained it with 2 features. And clearly, I have 3 triangles. That's why I picked this graph this way, because 3 triangles, each triangle is a 3-clique, is all that I need to cover all edges in the graph. So this is basically just an example of Erdős's result that says the intersection number is equal to the edge clique cover of a graph, and that is an NP-hard problem, as I mentioned on the previous slide.
Is it in NP?
Yeah, NP-hard, yeah.
But is it also in NP?
I think so, yeah. So there are quite a few nice results in extremal graph theory that are related to this topic, but haven't been explored in this area. So all of you know or have heard about Mantel's theorem connecting the number of edges and triangle-free graphs. And using similar proof techniques, a few researchers, I believe this result was by Erdős, just show that if you have any graph, the intersection number has to be less than or equal to n squared over 4. Then Noga Allon worked on this problem in the mid-1980s. As I said, not much interest in this problem lately. You can show if the graph is sparse, if its complement is sparse, or if there are some restrictions on the degrees, on the maximum degree of the graph, you can find the bounds on the intersection number. And you can also show which graphs are extremal in the terms of using the largest number of features to explain the graph. This is work by Fan Chung from the 1990s and Nancy Eaton from 1996. So we use, just to show you that this is actually a pretty useful concept, nothing to worry about in biology right now, but it's something we use to come up with or find communities of cross-communicating or talking segments of DNA in the process of DNA folding. So if you think of DNA as a strand which can fold up, coil up in such a way that parts of the string that are physically very remote can come close to each other, and you can take snapshots of which parts of the string communicated with another part of the string, you can basically get a picture of which are the physically interacting communities in the DNA string. And it's really easy to get interesting results based on these intersection representations using on these data sets, which is something I can take offline. So let me just go now and give you a flavor of a completely new topic in graph theory, which will go beyond this notion of intersection graphs. So what bothers us from the perspective of community detection in terms of using intersection graphs? My first concern, because I really like to work with practical data sets, was that the notion of the edge clique cover is quite restrictive. It assumes that each feature corresponds to one clique and one clique corresponds to one community. And that is very unrealistic because you're assuming that one community is fully interconnected. Usually we say that communities are defined as dense induced subgraphs in a network. So how can we get something that is much more realistic? So let's just think of the following thing. Let's just think of defining a graph. Here is a graph which has a 4-clique minus 1 edge and a 3-clique. And if I run the intersection representation for this graph, I'll obtain 3 different communities. Again, it's going to be 3 triangles. Nothing special here. And that is because we want really to have each community correspond to a clique. But if you look at this graph, it would make sense that this K4 minus 1, this complete graph on 4 vertices minus 1 edge, is a community by itself, because it's a dense component, and it may make more sense to call this a community. So what I would really like to have is something more of this form, where one triangle, this triangle here, is one community, and this K4 minus 1 is another community. Yes, please.
What's the threshold for saying it's a dense component?
Oh, no, I'm not getting there yet. I'll define it.
It's a dense component.
Yeah, I'm saying it's a dense component. In this example, I just took out one edge, but I'm going to redefine it in terms of what we call Boolean intersection graphs. So it's going to come to on the next slide. This is just to motivate a change in the definition. So if I want to do something like this, I would have to change the definition of an intersection representation, because I do not want to deal with cliques anymore. So that brings me to the topic of what we call Boolean intersection representations. And it's pretty neat because it allows you to have much more control over what you call communities based on feature sets, as well based on the induced subgraphs that you call your community structures. So let's just think of this following model. You fix a Boolean function, let's say a function that involves R variables, together with a vector P1 up to PR, which indicates how many features will be relevant in the feature set. And you partition the feature set F into R subsets. So just to make it less convoluted, maybe it's best to start with the feature set. You have a feature set F, you partition it into R subsets, and with each of these subsets, you associate one of the values P1 up to PR. And then you replace the requirement that elements in the same community, or vertices in the same community, share at least one common feature of F by saying that they share at least PI features from a feature set of type Fi, according to the Boolean function that is given to you. And this seems pretty complicated, so let me give you an example. It's actually pretty straightforward. Let's assume we have 3 different types of features. Family feature, something related to your family background. City features, cities you may have lived in, and hobby features. And it makes sense to partition them because they're very different types of features. And let's assume that the values I picked are P1, P2, P3 equal to 1, 1, and 2, and that the Boolean function of interest is x1 or x2 and x3. So what would be then the connection rule for edges in the graph? Let's say 2 people, based on this Boolean intersection model, are Facebook friends if and only if they're family members or they have lived in at least one common city and shared at least 2 hobbies. So I have a very, very broad way to define a community, because I'm saying the rules are that either they're family, that guarantees that you're Facebook friends, or if you're not family, then you have at least one common city you lived in, you met in that city, or you have at least 2 common hobbies. So the Boolean function here encodes exactly that function, because x1 corresponds to family, x2 corresponds to city, x3 corresponds to hobby. And all I'm saying is, for an edge to exist in this graph, I have to do assignments of features, which are first partitioned in such a way that I get an edge to exist if and only if this Boolean function is satisfied for the set of feature assignments I made. Is this clear? Hopefully. OK. So here, for example, is the simplest Boolean function that is not straightforwardly reducible to the intersection model. It's the Boolean end function. Just think of the simplest function possible, end, meaning you're partitioning your set of features into a R subset and you want to share at least one feature or at least pi features from each of the parts in your partition. And for example, in this case, I have 4 features, A1, A2, B1, B2. Let's say I partition the set of features into 2 subsets, A1 and A2, and B1 and B2. And now I'm asking about an assignment of pairs of subsets to vertices, and it's maybe an awkward notation, but this means I have one subset A1 and another subset B1, A2, B2, and now I'm saying an edge exists if and only if I require the pairs of sets to intersect in both positions. So for example, I have an edge here because A1 belongs both here, and B1 belongs to both this set and this set. And I don't have an edge here because I have A2 here, which intersects A2 here, but here I have B2 and B1 here, so there is no edge between these 2 vertices. So this is the simplest model. It's an end function, Boolean end function. And what is interesting to show, and it can be shown easily, is as long as your Boolean function involves only and ors, you will be able to reconstruct all the results you get for these Boolean intersection numbers by looking only at the results for the end function and the or function separately. And or reduces to classical intersection. That is something that you can check out. So if this is the definition, then I can, or explanation, I can give you a formal definition of what a co-intersection is, which is basically the definition of an intersection number when the Boolean function is end. And what is interesting, all the questions you asked for intersection numbers now carry over for co-intersection numbers or Boolean intersection numbers in general, but the communities now become really rich and interesting. So for example, let me point out one community that you wouldn't expect, for example, in classical intersections, the community defined by feature B1. So for example, the community defined by feature B1 is this triangle plus this edge. So it is basically an extension of the notion of a community where you have only cliques. You can add edges. For example, here, the community is 2 edges, so you're missing 1 edge between the vertices 3 and 5. And what is interesting is that the Boolean function itself determines the structure of the community and the density, which was a question before. The density of the community, because if you can find bounds on the intersection and the co-intersection or Boolean intersection numbers, and you can show basically that the graphs that are induced subgraphs that have these intersection numbers will have to have a certain density, especially clearly if the intersection numbers are small. So a way to basically deal with the definition of a community is to come up with a Boolean model and a different rule, intersection rule, and then the community structures will be still overlapping, but much richer than what you expect to see from a classical intersection model. And there are a lot of theoretical results that we've been working on in this area that ask the very classical combinatorial question. If you have, let's say, just the Boolean end function, what is the smallest number of features you need to explain any graph? Then you can go ahead and ask the same questions. What if the graph is sparse? What if the graph is dense? So we use some straightforward versions of Lovász-Lóka lemma to prove, let's say, this bound, which talks about vertices, graphs with vertices of bounded maximum degree. And another thing that is really frequently asked in extremal combinatorics are which graphs have the largest intersection or co-intersection numbers, and that can be addressed in this context as well. And there are a lot of really interesting questions in graph theory, algorithmic questions. How do you find these edge clique covers, or how do you find communities using this approach, given that the problems are NP hard? And a lot of applications. I just showed you the one where we used it in genomics. But if you're interested, I'll give you some references at the end of this part of the talk. So this was just an overview of a new direction in graph theory that allows you to look at communities from a perspective of shared features. So the last 10 minutes or so, I'll go over motif clustering, which shows you how to define communities based on densities of motifs, whatever you believe to be motifs in a network, rather than using, using classical edge densities. Yes?
So the bound that you obtained before, were they constructed bounds? Or they
Which bounds?
the bounds that you obtained before on the intersection previous slide?
Oh, the previous. Yes. Oh, okay. The co-intersection. Yes. So no, this is Lower-Sloka lemma, for example, 2. So we didn't use the no, not constructive. But if I find, if I show that a graph is an extremal graph, it has the largest number of features required for explaining it, then the proof is obviously constructive because I'm going to give an assignment of features that meets exactly this upper bound. But some of them are not. So for example, the second bound, it talks about a whole family of graphs, so it's not a constructive bound. Yeah. Again, those of you who have tried working or worked in community detection, at some point you may have heard about the problem of correlation clustering, again from the computer science community, and it's one of the famous Fox papers. It appeared in 2002, and the notion was first coined, or the idea was proposed by Bansal, Bloom, and Chawla. And the simplest formulation of the problem goes as follows. Again, you have a graph, as it's always the case with community detection problems. And you have pairs of objects that are similar or dissimilar. So for example, I can code similar or friendly objects by blue color. So these guys here are all friends, or similar objects, dissimilar or unfriendly people or objects are colored by orange. So these two people may not be friends. And the question that Bansal, Bloom, and Chawla asked is, if you represent these constraints with the graph where the edges are labeled by these colors based on friendship or non-friendship, can you partition the vertices into clusters so that you minimize the number of plus edges between clusters and the number of minus edges within clusters? Why? The number of plus edges between clusters is the number of friends you separated, and the number of edges, minus edges within the same cluster is the number of enemies you put in the same community or in the same group. So you really want to minimize the discrepancy or friendship discrepancy in some sense, because you want to put people that are friends together and people that are enemies separately, but you obviously cannot always do so. So this is a really interesting way to do clustering. You're doing partitioning on a graph because you don't require to know anything. You're not required to know anything about the number of clusters or number of communities. And this is a really good thing to have, because in all practical applications you really deal with, there is no indication that you will have any clue what the number of communities is supposed to be. So in this case, the number of clusters is not given. It's part of the optimization problem. And this is why people call this framework agnostic learning. So it's related to tons of different problems in graph theory, graph editing, graph partitioning, clearly sparsest cut, and rank aggregation. You heard in the previous talk some results on sorting and rankings or permutations. This problem is highly related to the problem of clustering or aggregating rankings as well. So there are two formulations, and the formulation I just give you is called minimum disagreement formulation. It says minimize the incorrectly classified edges, the number of incorrectly classified edges, but there is a analog of it which says maximize the correctly classified edges. And these are clearly dual questions, except that one is hard to deal with in the approximation domain, the other one isn't. Both problems are known to be NP hard, except for the fact that min disagree is much harder to approximate than max agree. And there were quite a lot of results in this area. And even one of the most recent papers at Fox was dealing with improvements of the min disagree approximability results, but I'll skip all these for the sake of time. And I just briefly say that the edges don't just have to be plus and minus edges indicating that people like or dislike each other. They can be weighted edges indicating the degree with which you like or dislike someone. So for example, I can assume, and this was in the original formulation from Bansal, Bloom, and Chawla, that each edge comes with two costs, a positive cost and a negative cost. And I apply the negative cost if I put the two vertices within the same cluster. So that's the cost I will pay when I put them in the same cluster. And the positive cost would be the cost I pay when I put two vertices of the corresponding edge within different clusters. And this is, again, an NP-hard problem, clearly, because the simpler version with the 0-1 weights was NP-hard. And the only results people really know in this area is when these weights satisfy some constraints. Oh, yeah, sure. So I'll skip over that. And how do people solve this? How do they usually solve this clustering problem? The idea goes back to the simplest algorithm that seems to be working for all questions of this type is using a simple procedure which says convert the underlying integer program into an LP and then round the solution. So this is something that is attributed to Charikar, Guruswamy, and Wirth. And the interpretation is pretty straightforward. You say that if I have an edge or two vertices in a graph, I assign an indicator variable to each edge, and I assign the value 1 to the edge if U and V are in the same cluster, if the endpoint vertices are in the same cluster, and I assign the value 0 if U and V, sorry, the other way around. U and V are in the same cluster, I assign the value 0, the value 1 if they're in the different cluster. And then the LP relaxation just says minimize the number of errors, which is basically minimize the number of vertices that should be in the same cluster but are placed across clusters, and the number of vertices that are placed within different clusters and should have been placed in the same cluster. And the only constraint you have is this constraint here for all pairs of vertices, because if you placed two edges that intersect at one vertex in the same cluster, then you have to place the third edge into the same cluster as well. There is no way to wiggle out of that constraint. So once you solve this problem, you will get fractional values because we relaxed it to be a LP. So my XUVs are between 0 and 1. And basically, if I solve it, I'll get a fractional value. So that's why you need to do rounding. And rounding means I have to decide if a value 0.4 should be treated as a 0 or a 1. Should I say that these two vertices for which the indicator variable is 0.4 should be in the same cluster or not? So this is what is called the LP plus rounding solution for correlation clustering problems. Since I only have a few more minutes, I want to show you that this kind of trick can be used. I think I have 3 minutes because we started late. I was watching the clock for sure. I started 5 minutes too. Sorry. So what if we ask the following question? We have this same problem in correlation clustering, except that now my penalties are associated with, let's say, triangles. So I want to pay one penalty if I put a triangle that is not to be separated, split, across two clusters, or if I put, and I get a certain award if I put the triangle within a good triangle within the same cluster. So this is what we could call, let's say, triangle motif clustering. So you're partitioning the vertices by maximizing the number of triangles inside clusters and minimizing the number of triangles that go across clusters. And we can do a weighted version of this problem as well. We can talk about motif conductance or triangle conductance as the number of cut triangles divided by the volumes of the motifs or the triangles. And for example, here is a graph cut. These are triangles that ended up on one side, and then there are some triangles that ended up across the cut. And so the goodness of a cut can be judged by the numbers of motifs that are dissolved or separated by using this approach. And this was something that was very recently proposed by the famous social network community group, Jure Leskovec at the Stanford SNAP lab. So because I'm running out of time, the interesting thing is it becomes really challenging to do correlation clustering with motifs. Because now you have to be able to assign these indicator variables to triangles, assign weights to triangles. do an LP, and then try to do a rounding procedure, which is complicated because I'm lumping triangles together, or edges of the triangle together, but triangles can intersect. They can share one edge, they can share no edges. So basically, or if I have higher structure motifs with 4 or 5 vertices, it becomes even more complicated. So if you're interested in this problem, we managed to show that there exists a constant approximation algorithm that will partition triangles or any K motif, meaning a motif involving a subgraph with K vertices, that has a constant approximation where the constant is basically a linear function of the number of vertices in the motif you have. So if you have 3 vertices, if you have triangle motifs, the approximation will be a 6 approximation. And what is really a bunch of interesting questions in optimization theory that come out of it, can you do something more efficient than LP and rounding because your number of constraints explodes? So you can use a nice approximation of stochastic based on stochastic gradient methods, which date back to Nip's paper from 2013. And then you can do assess the errors in your clusters by looking at what is called agnostic clustering approaches by Nina Balkan and others. And just to skip this, we applied these motif clustering on genomic networks, got some interesting results for cancer genomic research. You can find that on the paper as well. And I think I'm right on time, sorry. Thank you for your attention, and sorry that I crammed a lot of stuff in there. I just wanted to give you an overview of a bunch of new topics happening in this field. So thanks for your time.